Last week I said that I might not give a teisho tonight, but given the circumstances of the past week, and as indicated in my email today, I want to elaborate some reflections on the terrorist attack, especially from a Buddhist perspective. Now, in my teisho that I gave on the anniversary of 9/11, those of you who were here might remember that some of the evident things that Buddhist teachers pointed out, in circumstances like this. For example, remember Bernie Glassman speaking to Paul Knitter, famous Catholic theologian who was working in El Salvador in the 80s when the death squads were around, and Bernie cautioned him, saying, remember, you're the death squads. Or right after 9/11 itself, Sensei Janet Abels, now Roshi, who lived across the street from me at the time when I was at St. Joseph's in the village, said, remember, we are the terrorists. Or just Monday, one of my parishioners, a writer, said, well, I'm praying for the terrorists and praying for the terrorists and myself. It's all a similar sentiment. Really, really important. So we don't project outwards or forget what's here. Now, when they're saying things like that, it's more than saying, well, we all have that within us. We could all be terrorists, if under the right or rather wrong circumstances, which is true. I hope you realize we're all capable of it. But it's saying more than that. It's saying that we really are all connected. So whatever is, quotes, theirs is ours. It really is our sentiment, our action. And that's what's behind, as I've tried to explain before, Christ taking on in his humanity the sin of the whole world. Because it wasn't some special arrangement that God made, it was because it really was connected to it and awake to it. And could take it and metabolize it. It's called redemption. It does connect to a larger picture, and that's what we're always trying to wake up to in any mystical tradition. That's something that Buddhism particularly reminds us of. Another aspect here too is part of this bigger picture that we're talking of, and this is, if anything, even more challenging and more shocking than what we just discussed or just pointed out. I've got a couple of illustrations of this. One from Bernie Glassman once again. He's saying that everything is prajna, everything is wisdom. The whole picture is as it is. And at that level, you don't make this is good or this is bad, this is light, this is dark. It just is, and you're able to be with it. And he says in this book, Infinite Circle. So prajna is empty, prajna wisdom is empty, things as they are, and empty in the sense that it has no content of its own. But the functioning reality of every moment, as it is it. So he says, being hot, we sweat. Sweating is the wisdom of being hot. You light a candle, the light is prajna. We walk in the rain, we get wet, like tonight, that's prajna. We step on a dog turd, and our shoe stinks, that's prajna. A Nazi putting a young child into the Auschwitz gas chamber is also prajna. So that's what it is. It is what it is, and we're connected to it. That's a Jew's folks, Jews speaking. Yeah? Bernie. Now, he's not saying, and we're not saying, that at a really important level, there's no good or bad, there's no right or wrong. No, that is absolutely not what we're saying. But we are saying, kind of what St. Paul says when he says all things work together for the good, from a Christian point of view, that at a certain level you're able to take it all in, not resist, not recriminate, not project, and somehow find what? We'll find what? Wisdom, peace, very similar idea here in a very different book from a different perspective. And Conversations with God, which some of you may know. Whether it's with God or not, it certainly sounds like it could be. But he has, a similar idea here. When we're talking about how can all these evil things happen if God is good, the usual thing. And the response is, this is difficult to hear, but I tell you this, there's perfection in everything. Strive to see the perfection. This is the change of consciousness of which I speak. So that's what we're talking about. Feel your feelings, cry your cries, laugh your laughs. This is, you're fully alive, you're fully connected. It's exactly what St. Paul says. Weep with those who weep, laugh with those who laugh. Be all things to all people. We're all connected. Yet when all the emotion is done, be still and know that I am God. Quote from the Psalm, but also, when all is said and done, this is it. In other words, he says, in the midst of the greatest tragedy, see the glory of the process. Even as you die with a bullet through your chest, even as you are being gang raped. Wow. Now this sounds like such an impossible thing to do, yet when you move to God consciousness, you can do it. In a moment of great tragedy, the challenge always is to quiet the mind and move deep within the soul. So that would explain how Jesus could commend his spirit to the Father, even in the midst of great agony and abandonment. Commend his soul to the Father in the midst of that and redeem the world. Or how a Zen monk, there are stories of this, Zen monks can sit there while a samurai comes in ready to chop off his head. If he does, he does. If he doesn't, he doesn't. And he goes a little further, which is still in an interesting way to explain, a little bit how this works. He says, you automatically do this when you have no control over it. How does he mean? Listen. Have you ever talked with a person who accidentally ran a car off a bridge? Or found himself facing a gun? Or nearly drowned? Often they will tell you that time slowed way down. That they were overcome by a curious calm. That there was no fear at all. And that's true. People do say that. And that's getting close to what we're talking about. In the midst of something that's completely out of your control, that's so monstrous and so huge, somehow you let go into something much bigger. So hopefully that happens when people are come down. It is what it is. Huh? It's not easy to understand. Well, it's impossible to understand on this level. Of course it is. We're not talking about this level. Now, talking about this, bigger picture, another dimension here is, this is something I emphasize at great length in my homily email to you. One thing the terrorists, the Islamic terrorists, reproach the West for is being secular, not being devoted to God, but being secular. And I insisted in my homily that secularity is the only way of life that really respects religion. Why? First of all, because it allows different religions to flourish at the same time. The Second Vatican Council pointed out in its decree on human dignity that no state can impose and no state can prevent people worshiping the way they wish. Publicly. No state can impose and no state can prevent. Well, that's a place in the world that's not true. Not just Islam. So where you have one religion, one state, and one culture, whether you're talking about Myanmar, or Israel, or Afghanistan, or whatever Christian country it might be, it's dangerous. It's dangerous because if you just have one culture and others would be suppressed and find it difficult. Actually, some of you may know that in Europe, after the religious wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, one of the compromises was cuius regio eius religio. In other words, whoever's land it was, whatever princedom it was, whatever duchy, it was his religion. Can you imagine something so ridiculous? And it was politically expedient, but it's totally against human rights. So if the Duke of Saxony was Protestant, everybody in Saxony had to be Protestant. So that's why the founding fathers of this country said, no religion is going to be official separation of churches, which is the way it should be. But there's a deeper reason for secularity, and this is something that Buddhists are always reminding themselves. It protects whatever religion from taking itself and its customs and its culture and its particular mindset and rules and ways too seriously as being itself the absolute. I have been very struck over the years by how much, in whatever religious tradition, including Christianity, we so easily, more and more, come to identify the particular cultural manifestation or ways of articulating our religion as if they weren't actually divine, as if it was actually the absolute itself. Now that is what we can't do. Everything is relative in that way. Nothing is the absolute except the absolute. Buddhism says emptiness is form, form is emptiness, absolute is relative, relative is absolute. But precisely because of that, you can't squelch the two together. They're both right here and now, but they're not same. So you find the absolute here, but this is not the absolute. It's right there, the absolute. You've got to move to another level of consciousness, which we've been talking about during this whole teisho, moving to a whole different level of consciousness within reality. So here's where you can bring the traditions together. There's a Mahayana commentary on Mark, where it points out that Jesus' fight with the Pharisees was always because they took the rules to be the absolute. Exactly what we're talking about. They took the rules as if they were the absolute. And Jesus was always messing that up. The Sabbath was made for man, not man. And of course they killed him for it. The empires of the world, the religious empires don't like that. But that's what the great religious figures do. And they were able to relativize everything, and therefore, within that experience, find sacred. So that's why Bodhidharma said, "There's no holy. Don't take too seriously, the externals, the sacred and profane as a dichotomy. Or remember the teisho with the blade of grass being the cathedral, being the temple. Everything becomes luminous with God. Everything has an absolute there. But you're not kept from seeing that by making one thing holy and one thing not. One way to dress and one way to think, etc. So that's really important. It's the old koan about the world is vast and wide, so why do you put on your robe and sit down in bed? It's a koan. So there's a secularity, which is itself a gateway to religion. Now, Stephen Batchelor has an article in this month's tricycle. And he's one who's been saying, we have to move into a more secular style of Buddhism so we don't too much identify the forms with the absolute itself. And there's a great point to that. It's interesting that he comes from a Protestant tradition, and he appreciates Zen, which does, so quickly get beyond, the external. And criticizes tendencies in certain schools like Theravada, to be orthodox in their thinking and the customs that you lose sight of the distinction. So, for example, he points out that we shouldn't talk about the Four Noble Truths, but the Four Noble Tasks. It becomes very practical. It becomes people-oriented. It becomes oriented towards suffering. It's like Pope Francis points out, or as Bernie Glassman always points out. It's not in your head. It's not a system. So don't talk about Four Noble Truths. Talk about the Four Noble Tasks. Because truth, he says, when you talk about truth as if you have it, or your system is it, then there's power involved, which is always dangerous. So, sometimes things he says we shouldn't. He says nirvana is what did he call it? A neutral moral territory. An ethically neutral moral territory. It's a little more than that. But he has a point about these systems and truths being identified with the absolute, and it becomes power. I have the truth. I do have, and it becomes a powerful structure.